Moses Gashirabake, who was almost a decade ago a student of mine at Concordia University. And as a teacher, one of the things that's very gratifying is to see what happens to your students once they move on and what they become and what they do later in life, right? And I couldn't be prouder of a former student because Moses has moved on to do lots of interesting things, right? Moses is the CEO of Mogashi and Partners, a law firm that he started. Yeah, he's a business and community leader that's recognized for his civic engagement. He has 2 degrees in common law and civil law from McGill University and an honors degree in political science from Concordia. That's where I had the pleasure of teaching him, and he was my student, right? As part of that political science degree, he specialized in sustainability, diversity, and inclusion, right? He's very active in his Rwandan Canadian community, survivor of the unfortunate genocide that occurred in Rwanda, he and his family, right? So Moses has passion for philanthropy, and he likes to support anything that has to do for, diversity, inclusion, civic leadership, and engagement, right? In 2018, he was appointed to serve on the board of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation by the Minister of Canadian Heritage, and he serves on some other boards, including the Foundation for Genocide Education and, the International Rwanda Youth for Development, right? So it's with great pleasure that I'm going to turn things over to Moses to speak to you guys a little bit about, systemic racism.
Thank you, Professor, for that kind introduction. And I must say that I'm extremely proud to have been your student. 10 years ago, it seems like a long time ago at Concordia, but I came to Canada 14 years ago, exactly 14 years ago. I came here as a former refugee and a survivor of the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda. And one of the things that I never thought would happen is, me sitting in a college, an institution of higher learning in Canada, and sharing my thoughts. So that was made possible largely because of, some of my professors that taught me at Concordia, and Professor Ara Karabogosian is one of them. There's professors like Rosemary Shada, and many others that really allowed me to not just be a student, but to also contribute in the community. And so, when I come back to participate and to contribute ideas with people that really taught me and gave me all the knowledge and the tools that I needed, it's such an honor. So of course, we're coming into such a strange time. So we're going through the COVID-19 pandemic, and there's a lot of things happening. And of course, some of the things that I'm going to talk about, these are things that, from a personal perspective, I've seen them happening within the Rwandan Canadian community. I've seen them happening within, other minority communities, newcomers to Canada and whatnot. So these are things that, for me, are not just academic topics. It's not just social science, but these are real, everyday life issues. And when you step back and reflect, it allows you to treat them with a lot of, humility, and with a lot of course, human touch, and of course, also wanting to understand the opinions of others and what they think. So the topic today, systemic discrimination and economic growth. One of the things that I've seen is that when you live in a society where a good chunk of the society, and I'm talking about, in developing countries, but this, for some reason, is creeping into developed nations as well, when, you have a big chunk of the society being extremely, poor, poverty in the sense where their economic chances are not guaranteed, then you see many negative things happening in those societies. So it could be violence, it could be lack of educational attainment within those quarters, and many other negative ills. So for me, I think it really would make sense to sort of like find a way to increase the economic opportunities for these people. And basically, the argument has been, if you grow the economy, then things like systemic discrimination, violence and whatnot are going to reduce. But I also think it could be the other way. So if you tackle, the main causes of a lack of opportunity for people, and these are unfortunately sometimes structural issues, then the economy will grow, because the more you put money into the pockets of as many people as possible, then the money is going to circulate. And there's a scholar who did a study, correlating the level of democratic development and economic growth. And of course, when you have high levels of democracy, high levels of economic growth, then you're much more likely to have, the negative ills in society going down. But there's another scholar who looked at the fact that actually if you deal with the root causes, and today we're dealing with systemic discrimination, which unfortunately is affecting black people in Canada, indigenous people in Canada, brown people in Canada, and many other people of color, unfortunately, are being discriminated against because of who they are, religion, and I'll go deep into the topic, and of course, I'm not assuming that necessarily if someone is going through discrimination, they're necessarily economically disempowered. But I'm just looking at it from a macro perspective, from a societal perspective. So this is interesting again because we just came out of a federal election. So when you look at the Canadian situation and the Quebec situation, if we narrow down provincially, and next year we're having an election in Quebec, and we as students, as professionals, as professors, are we going to hold accountable the political leaders to actually bring solutions? So about 2 days ago, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau swore in his new cabinet, which included, for the first time, the Minister of Housing and Diversity and Inclusion. And so this is in the name of Minister Ahmed Hussein, who I happen to know. He's from the Somalian Canadian community. He happens to be Muslim. And he came to Canada as a refugee as well. So he's not just a double minority, but he's actually a triple minority. So religion, color, and the fact that neither French or English are his mother tongue. So after taking his oath of office, Minister Hussein tweeted that diversity is a fact, but inclusion is a choice. So the current COVID-19 pandemic has revealed key weaknesses in Canada's economic fabric, which, and with majority of the groups such as newly arrived immigrants, blacks, brown people, and Indigenous Canadians are being the most affected by low employment rates, low incomes, poor housing, and the lack of access to basic needs such as clean drinking water. Unfortunately, in Canada, there are some Indigenous communities that don't have access to clean drinking water. And this is, if you compare it with their white counterparts, unfortunately, research is showing that, this is happening. So echoing Minister Hussein's tweet, Canada is at a crossroads at the moment where key choices must be made to end systemic discrimination, and that, I argue, will grow Canada's economy. So if you put, money into pockets of Canadians, and essentially, this is not just amounts to survive on, but actually, the ability for someone to feed their family, to have access to a better job opportunity, and to be able to live a fulfilled life. So a lack of inclusion to the access of economic benefits for minority groups based on color, gender, language, religion, ethnicity, sexual orientation has been linked to systemic racism in Canada. Systemic racism is Canada's problem too. We can remember the cases of Arlene Reed, Bonifacio Romero, and Joyce Echaquan, which is just 3 of the thousands of lives that have been lost in Canada, but in many ways characterize who is dying during the COVID-19 pandemic, and when you also want to have access to healthcare. So the Broadbent Institute reported 6 months into the COVID-19 pandemic that race-based data collected by the Toronto Public Health shows that Black and Brown Torontonians make up 73% of the COVID-19 cases, while representing only 36% of the population. So this, all points to something that is systemic discrimination in Canada, which also points to the economic issues that we all must come together to solve. And this is not just, for politicians. I think students have power. I think professionals in any field have power. It doesn't have to be just politicians, because we look at leadership in terms of political leadership, but there's business leadership, there's legal leadership, there's leadership at the school level, where you actually come together and find solutions. Additionally, gender intersections must be acknowledged. Obviously, there is no simple way to reduce things to a singular advantage or disadvantage, because somebody could be a Black woman or a brown woman or an Indigenous woman who also happens to be handicapped, or who also happens to need other supports, or the ability for them to access a job opportunity, the ability for them to go to the hospital and be able to be treated equally. So rather, systemic racism often manifests in different ways for Black, Brown, Indigenous men versus women, or the LGBTQIA2S plus individuals. So this also has to be taken into consideration. So my presentation argues that there is a relationship between systemic racism and economic growth. And essentially, I will present 2 key recommendations or solutions on why ending systemic racism is a good thing for Canada. Essentially, people talk about, reducing racism. Let's end it. I think, that's what we need to do. We need to end some of the ills that are part of our societies, and that's, we talk about how the economy is growing, but I don't think the economy can grow if we still have some people that do not have equal access to opportunities. So policy recommendations can take cue from the theory of stratification economics. And essentially, stratification economics brings together knowledge that has been produced across a range of disciplines to understand the nature of racism and its impacts. So the primary insight of stratification economics is that societal institutions and policies are designed to maintain a relative advantage of social groups in power and to disadvantage other social groups. the main social group in power in Canadian society, and this is the truth, ultimately, and this is even throughout much of the world. I come from Africa. I was born in Rwanda, and we all know the ills that colonialism, for example, brought about in Africa, European nations coming to Africa to colonize African countries. And I think it's the same for Canada, where European settlers came in to Canada and took over the land, and essentially, the domination that occurs. So systemic racism throughout institutions and policies is designed to maintain the advantage of white people, unfortunately. So that even when a rising tide lifts all boats or troubled waters sink them, the relative position is maintained. And this is true across intersections with race, such as those based on income, education, and gender. And I'm quite optimistic because the current federal government came out and acknowledged that systemic racism actually exists in Canada. And the process of assessing and reassessing the white advantaged by disadvantaging Black, Brown, and Indigenous Canadians and other non-white groups is what is referenced by the visceral term white supremacy. So given all many manifestations of systemic racism, the key to breaking this system is to disrupt the manifestations that are connected to economic inequality, because it is economic inequity that results in widespread power to control institutions and policies. So my first policy recommendation focuses on the immediate need for Canada to commit itself to collecting information on indicators of structural racism in our society, and on health and other metrics of well-being across racial, socioeconomic, and other social groups in Canadian society. So the first policy recommendation is data collection. We all know that in order for policy makers to make the right decisions, they need to base them on scientific knowledge or data, something that you can point fingers on and the numbers and say, because a particular group, and these are the numbers, are facing a particular issue, then we need to move in a different direction. One of the most frustrating aspects of attempting to address racial inequity in Canada is the lack of deep and nuanced quantitative information about the dynamics happening in our own country. So quantitative data is no guarantee, of course, for change, because you could have the data and then nothing happens. But scholars, dating back to W.E.B. Du Bois, have assessed that it is critical, that it is a critical component of understanding and conveying facts about racism and racial inequity. So essentially collecting data is quite important. So there are three fundamental issues regarding the availability of data in Canada: collection, access, and ownership. So how is the data collected? How is it accessed? And who owns it? So the main source of information about systemic racial inequity in Canada comes from the data collected by Statistics Canada. Among other things, information about race, immigration, and extensive economic indicators is collected on the long-form census. And maybe some of you have participated in the process last year, which is normally administered to 20% of the Canadian population every 5 years. So the last one was in 2020. So this is how we know that the 2015 average employment income of racialized women was about $33,000, while for white women, it was about $38,000. And for racialized men, about $44,000, while for white men, it was about $56,000, close to $57,000. So these numbers are available only every 5 years, and the 20% sample size contains too few black Canadians, as well as an incomplete sampling of indigenous people to understand the details and their specific circumstances. So the other main source of data comes from Statistics Canada, which is another Government of Canada institution. And these are administered more often, but have a very smaller sample size of black Canadians. So for example, the Canadian Community Health Survey that was administered every year to about 100,000 Canadians asks a few important questions about, health status, healthcare access, and socio-demographic and socioeconomic characteristics, including race. So 100,000 is not, a key. So, however, the sample of black Canadians in this survey is far too small to do, a detailed analysis of the health of black Canadians. So in addition, the survey unfortunately excluded those living on reserves or other Aboriginal settlements in the provinces. So essentially, the Statistics Canada survey is not enough. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada calls to action, report repeatedly, and directs governments to provide new and improved data collection to better track the health and socioeconomic status of Indigenous people. Yet, in 5 years, unfortunately, no progress has been made. Statistics Canada, and of course, they do the yearly survey and the 5-year survey. They need to commit themselves to a principle of data collection that makes it possible to fully understand the extent and dynamics of structural racism and racial inequity in Canadian society. And this can be done, in various ways. It could be done through funding and undertaking this work, and it should be a priority for policymakers. So my policy recommendation number 1, data collection. And once the data is collected, it needs to reflect the percentages within the Canadian society as well. My policy recommendation number 2 is essentially based on the fact that ending systemic discrimination could be a means to grow Canada's economy. And essentially, the COVID-19 pandemic has revealed what was already known, but it made it super obvious. I watched presentations from previous speakers for this social science festival, and they alluded to the same thing. So the pandemic has indeed presented major economic challenges for Canada, and interventions have to be made. So even though the Government of Canada, of course, introduced the pandemic benefits to economically vulnerable Canadians, such as the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, or CERB, the Canada Recovery Benefit, or the CRB, and other types of benefits to businesses and to institutions. We're currently facing massive housing shortages, a sharp rise in inflation, the cost of living, and labor shortages in Canada. And people will be able to conduct business as well, because if you give access to loans, it has been documented extensively that unfortunately, if you're brown, black, or Indigenous, accessing a business loan is a problem. So this is money that just stays in the bank, and when money stays in the bank, it doesn't circulate in the economy, and it could be negative for communities. So globally as well as in Canada, the past decades provided a massive boom for the rich and a bust for the poor. And it has also sort of like created a hollowing out for everyone in the middle. So you have a very small number of people that are extremely rich, an increasing number of people that are, extremely poor, and then the middle class is shrinking. And it was a big debate even in the last federal elections, people asking themselves, how much money do you need to be considered to be in the middle class? And there was no clear answer. There was no politician that could, determine that. But it's a telltale sign that's showing that the middle class is shrinking as well. So statistics show rapidly rising income inequality and even more rapidly rising wealth inequality. What is less discussed is that most of the rich are white. And while Black, Indigenous, and other people of color are largely relegated to the lowest income and wealth levels. Because of anti-Black racism and settler colonial policy, Black and Indigenous people have the fewest economic resources. And this is not, of course, as I said before, to assume that if you're Black, if you're Indigenous, if you're brown, you're necessarily economically disadvantaged. But if you look at the cross-section of society, then you find that a bigger percentage of those people are being given the short end of the stick, and it has to change. The dominant policy discourse regarding economic inequality in Canada has revolved around strategies that would raise the income floor. So essentially, if the minimum wage is X amount, why don't we raise it to X plus, Y and make it bigger? So these strategies are effectively designed, to reduce, absolute poverty rates. Most notably, there have been efforts to raise the minimum wage in paid employment and attempts to create a basic income program that would guarantee Canadians who fall below a given income threshold some minimum income. And of course, that threshold is still, a point of debate. So how much money, what's the minimum amount of money does somebody need to earn? Do we need a guaranteed minimum income in order for the economy to be fair for everyone? So the principles of using policy to set wage standards and to provide a safety net for those who have fallen on hard times is critical and is likely to be beneficial for Black and Indigenous people because they are the most affected by low-paying jobs, by unemployment, and of course, not being able to break into, a situation whereby they are able to live a better life. However, the current policy imagination is still quite limited in this regard, because for me, it's not just necessary to set a policy that reduces extreme poverty, but does not really give people the ability to have access to opportunities that actually create wealth. People to start businesses, people to have access to jobs, and being able to produce wealth. But if you just give them a minimum amount of money that's just, going to keep them poor, but is not inspiring them to create or to produce, then you're just, applying a Band-Aid solution, in my humble opinion. So, I believe there must be room for a much more fundamental shift in how the labor market and the social policies provide for decent work, access to business opportunities, decent wages for everyone who wants to work. Investing in measures that provide access to education and training, stable jobs, and proper income supports must be a priority, especially targeted at racialized populations that are the hardest hit by the systemic racism pervading our labor markets. Finally, we must do something about wealth inequality. And this is, the biggest shift in the room. I might sound like Jagmeet Singh, and the funny thing that you're going to learn is that my views are actually liberal. I'm not, to the left of the spectrum when it comes to economics. But, the biggest elephant in the room, which unfortunately not many people target, is that, I'm not advocating for, hyper-taxing the rich or, removing all the opportunities that they had and giving the money to the poor. But it's essentially creating a system that would be fair for all and allowing some of that wealth to be redistributed in such a way that, we will be able to have more harmony, less violence, less incidences of discrimination, as you may. So wealth is essentially what allows inequality to persist across generations because it gives children of the wealthy a massive head start in life. This is not only because the experiences and opportunities wealthy parents and grandparents can give to their children, but also financial burdens they may help them avoid. Whether it's paying for post-secondary education, avoiding risky debt to purchasing a home, or accessing business loans and other financing. Wealthy families provide several privileges and opportunities to build a prosperous life. And I'm not saying, being wealthy is a bad thing. It's a good thing. What I'm saying is, if you have a system that, 90% of the wealth belongs to 1% of the population, there is a problem. And if there is a structure that allows for that to happen, where the super rich are not paying enough taxes, then for me, that is a recipe for disaster. So this leads to higher rates of post-secondary degree admission and completion, as well as more widespread home ownership among the privileged compared to the not so privileged groups. So through this intergenerational lens, what becomes clear is that wealth is the engine of income rather than income being the engine for wealth. And the role of parents and grandparents is not a hyperbole. I mean, it's not advertised in our day-to-day life, but it's something that we need to look into. In fact, intergenerational gifts are the number one source of wealth inequity in Canada. Thus, the ongoing economic advantage to some needs to be shifted in order to benefit as many people as possible. So it is the result of much greater probability that one is born into wealth as well as not facing other sources of systemic racism. Black and indigenous economic disadvantage is not due to any number of racist tropes that are routinely exercised as explanations about lack of trying or a lack of cultural value of education. Rather, it is due to prior generations who, due to racism, haven't been able to accumulate wealth, and in addition experiencing a slew of other sources of systemic racism. So I talked about, colonialism and the fact that, the power has not been able to shift for the benefit of as many people as possible. So while there is a wide array of proposals focused on tackling income inequality, there are fewer pointed at rectifying wealth inequity. One method that has gained momentum here in Canada and across the globe are an annual wealth tax and an increased inheritance tax on large fortunes. So the objective is twofold. One, to provide a disincentive to wealthy people hoarding and collecting revenues to fund programs that reduce the wealth gap on the other end of the spectrum. A priority should also be placed on mechanisms that seek to create wealth from a community standpoint, such as community benefit agreements negotiated as part of large infrastructure projects. So if you understand that wealth inequality is a more significant feature of economic racism than income inequality, and we wish to solve it within a foreseeable future, then we need to be bold and creative about all kinds of solutions to consider. I'd like to leave a little bit of time for some sort of a discussion. I'd like to hear what you think. And it's quite interesting that the future generations, and this is something that I've seen with fellow millennials or the generation that has come after us, is that these are topics that they discuss much more often. So I'd like to hear your thoughts. But before that, I'd like to conclude that addressing the problem of systemic racism and racial inequities in the COVID-19 pandemic requires us to rectify the ills that were created by past generations in order to have a better long-term positive economic growth. And these issues deeply entrenched in systemic racism in Canada, particularly racism against Black, Brown, and Indigenous people and other identities, then we need to look at it that we all have to do something about it. So there is a major role for also governments, because we as the people, we empower governments, we vote for them to find solutions. So they have a role to play in these issues as well. But we also need to have business leaders, lawyers, professors, students coming in. And policy can go a long way in solving racial inequity, but it cannot be symbolic or timid. Uncovering the truth about racial inequality must be followed with clear actions and have substantive impact on people's lives. And people have to be bold. A couple of years ago, people could not agree that actually systemic racism exists in Canada. And unfortunately, within the Quebec province, I don't think the government of Quebec has fully agreed that systemic racism exists in Quebec. I live in Gatineau. My neighbors are Quebecois, amazing people. When you say systemic racism exists in a society, it's not to say everyone is racist, absolutely not. But it's basically to say that it's a problem that is, from a general perspective, can be identified. So the answer to the fact that systemic racism exists in Quebec, and the government says Quebecers are not racist, I think that's that's answering the wrong questions, the wrong question. So we need to face it with boldness and with courage. So ignoring the problems that have been made clear in 2020 and right before the COVID-19 pandemic threatens to further normalize and embed the systemic racism that plagues us. And I think if we don't take that upon ourselves, then we're going to see more cases of violence, more cases of, a lack of housing, homelessness, and a broken society. So we need to come together. So we must make bold changes to our society if we truly are interested in solving racial inequities. If we do not, or if we only focus on addressing shorter-term COVID-19 inequities or other racial inequities that are going to come in the short term, then we will be no further ahead in terms of solving Canada's true challenges. I thank you.
Thank you, Moses. Okay, folks, the floor is yours. Anybody have any questions for Moses on the basis of some of the things that he presented or said? Takes one person. I need one person to break the ice, then I'm sure we're going to get into a flow of questions. So, anybody? Right? Nothing Moses said was controversial? Huh? Or sparks any type of emotion? No? No? Come on, folks. Anybody out there on the live stream can also ask a question.
I think I'm seeing someone. Is it
Where?
someone
Missing a
lifting?
hand?
Probably not.
No? Okay. No. Come on. Somebody has to have a question about some of the information.
I mean, it could be a comment. It doesn't
As
have
well.
to be.
Okay, so you guys are killing me here. I had 11 presentations this week, and every one of them, I didn't have a problem getting questions, and you're leaving the last one to stress me out, right? On a topic like systemic discrimination that we've been talking about and debating, especially here in Quebec with our current administration denying that it exists. No one. Everybody wants to go home, right? Bruce? Angelo? Yeah? I'm going to come around. Hold on.
Hi. My question, I guess, is at the tail end of your presentation, you were talking about how governments may not necessarily recognize or seek not to recognize the existence of systemic discrimination. You also said that they represent us. So if we believe that systemic discrimination is real, what are some of the steps that we can take to get them to overcome their resistance to acknowledging it?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. So one of the issues is that, democracy is quite interesting. Every 4 or 5 years we have elections and members of parliament are elected. But the funny thing is, if you go deep into the issue, is that the composition of, for example, if you go on the federal level, the Canadian black population is about maybe 3.5%. But if you look at the members of parliament who are black within the House of Commons, is about maybe 1.7%. So because of systemic racism, unfortunately, we are underrepresented in that sense. So, from a general perspective, government is supposed to be representative of everyone. And I think the problem comes about when to the policymakers. But I think that's changing a little bit. Before 2015, I think the numbers were quite low. They were somewhere, 0 point something percent. But now they've moved to 1 point something percent, which is good. I hope at some point will be able to have representation. So if we have X amount of people within a community, then they have enough advocates for them. So what has changed from 2015, and maybe we could go back in other elections, is that, you know, the issues of systemic racism and discrimination have, obviously it's not just because, you know, black politicians were elected. There are other international, you know, forces, you know, the death of George Floyd and police brutality in the US and whatnot that kind of, you know, highlighted some of these issues and the COVID-19 pandemic. But I think the fact that we have about 6 black members of parliament at the House of Commons, and I'm just sampling just, you know, the federal politics side of things, you know, they're able to advocate for some of these issues, so their lived experience. You know, one of the MPs that I know in Hall Aylmer, Honorable Greg Fergus, is a black MP, and some of his colleagues could not believe that, you know, his ancestors were slaves and whatnot. So there's, I think, an education perspective and increasing representation for some of these marginalized groups in order to have a truly representative government. But I think it also shouldn't be an excuse if we don't have a parliament or a House of Commons that has, you know, the right combinations of MPs for different communities. I think a democracy should also be able to protect its minority groups and bring all the issues. You know, it's not just, you know, the issue of the day that gets to be uplifted. That's sort of like what I'm thinking. So my hope is that, you know, we'll have more representation and some of these issues are going to be brought to light. Yeah, so that's what I think. I'm not sure if you have any thoughts as well. I don't claim to have, you know, the gospel truth or the big solution to all of these issues. I'm more than happy to hear what you think. Thanks.
As my students will attest, I always have thoughts, and unfortunately for them, and I keep them as long as I possibly can to share my thoughts with them. And for those of them that thought they would escape that today, I think it makes sense in this forum of your discussion to say that knowledge is power, in the sense that public policy, good public policy, is based on empirical evidence, evidence that's collected, right? And we've seen in the past that governments of certain stripes don't necessarily listen to the evidence that sort of is brought to them.
Yes.
And so I would imagine that a progressive society, a society that knows itself, is one that is open to asking itself questions or being asked questions. So you mentioned the long-form census.
Yes.
Are there questions that you think, could that be an adequate vehicle then to sort of push the sort of ideas that you're talking about, to ask the kinds of questions automatically?
Yes.
On a 5-year basis, outside of the scope of government to actually affect the census, and simply that information is then released to the public, to academics, who can then help shape the public policy discussion. And is that something that we should be advocating for?
Oh yeah, absolutely, because, you know, the long form, you know, there have been people that are advocating for, you know, more specific questions. You know, when they created it, even the people who created the form need to be cognizant of the fact that, you know, it's going to a wide array of Canadians, essentially. So one of the other things that is interesting is, I think 3 years ago, so from a public policy perspective, they created an anti-racism secretariat. So essentially that's going to look at, you know, all government forms, government policies, you know, old, existing and future ones. You know, how do we make sure that they're being looked at from the lens of the people that were not considered during, the formulation of these policies or the creation of these forms. And it's, obviously it's 3 years. It takes quite some time before, a policy can be looked at. And unfortunately, as you mentioned, some governments, depending on who's in power, they reject empirical evidence. So I think at the end of the day, there needs to be more activism to ensure that these policies are reflective of the people that they are going to affect. Because unfortunately, it has not been like that since Confederation in 1867. Because I'm assuming when Canada was created, the economic model, the government, and the traditions and the outcomes that were being sought after, they have changed over time, but they could keep evolving. We have had in the early 60s waves of immigration coming to Canada, and Canada has planned to have, I think, close to 400,000 new immigrants coming into Canada. So when we're taking statistical information for policy formulation, would, the long form census form, would it be relevant for that kind of Canada? So these are questions that I deal with. I, have been sitting on the board of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, and it's unfortunate that some of the policies and the recommendations that come out, they're not adopted immediately, despite the fact that, there is evidence and data. But the evidence and the data, when it comes to certain communities in Canada, is still, being developed. So that has to happen as well. So it's to be honest, frustrating, especially for these communities. It's a lived experience for them each and every day. The fact that they have to, to fill out a form that maybe will not create any impact for them because they happen to be not the majority. So how do we make sure that we create those policies that allow for everyone to, have not just the bare minimum, but the ability for them to live a safer, a life that is more, more secure for them and their children, essentially.
You stated that the political parties are not acknowledging the reality of systemic racism, and I know my professor asked about the steps that could be taken by our society for those political parties to start acknowledging this issue. But I want to know what you think is the main or many reasons the steps are not being taken today in 2021, where information and knowledge can be shared so easily through tools like social media, for example.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So in terms of the steps, I think, as your professor mentioned, education is important, but once someone is educated about an issue, would they necessarily move in a particular direction? The unfortunate thing about politics, sometimes decisions are made because of the next election. So essentially, if you have a particular opinion or a particular idea that you're espousing, you're essentially representing some sort of a group of people. And I think, one of the reasons why, it's not going as fast as it should is essentially, that the status quo really does not want to shift to reality and understanding that, you know, the reality actually allows you to create better policies that in the long term are going to be beneficial for everyone. So it's essentially the shift in power. So are you willing to lose a bit of your power and empower other people? It's obviously not as easy as it can be. On the federal government level, there has been some recognition that systemic racism exists. On the provincial end, it's still not the case. But I think one of the ways is to continue the activism and to get as many people, as many Canadians, because I think it's not just changing the minds of politicians. I think it's being able to convince Canadians that this is a reality, that it's a reality for example, people who come to Canada and they qualify as nurses and they're not able to practice their profession because they're being asked to go back to school for 3 years to requalify. When if you look at, you know, I've seen even people coming from, for example, the UK, in some of the statistical documents, and they have to go back to school. I mean, those are the things that, you know, could be looked at and basically, you know, look at the impact on families. So if you come in with a medical degree or a nursing degree and you want to practice in Canada and you have a family, you can't, you know, go back to school for a particular period of time, but, you know, we could look at ways to maybe shorten the qualification period, because if you look at the equivalencies, someone who's practiced in the UK and, you know, they could easily practice, for example, in Toronto. You know, these are some of the things that could be done. But it's essentially being an activist in your own community, in your own neighborhood, and allowing as many Canadians to know the lived experiences of these people that come in as new Canadians or people who came because of the transatlantic slave trade, and now they find themselves many, many years after Confederation, that they are not really fully integrated into the Canadian society because of systemic racism. So I think it's educating as many people as possible, and hopefully, you know, when the minds of as many Canadians have changed, then the politicians will also move in that direction. But I think if you look at it, a good number of Canadians really understand that this is an issue, and it has to be addressed.
Hi. I've seen it become a trend among people who I've talked to who don't support the Black Lives Matter movement. They say that they don't support it because they associate the movement with the riots that happened in Seattle. So what do you say to people who make that sort of false association between the message of the Black Lives Matter movement and the disastrous riots that happened?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I'm not going to pretend that I'm an expert in, I guess, you know, all black issues and people supporting movements and not supporting them. But for me, essentially, I would say that these movements exist because of a problem that, you know, has existed since the creation of Canada, or since, you know, the fact that, you know, people are brought from Africa and brought to Europe and other nations. You know, these are things that have existed for so long that activists are taking many different formats, and unfortunately, some of these movements tend to veer off the main message. But I think the core of the message is essentially advocating for equality. So I wouldn't say I would necessarily agree or disagree with them, but I would say that be an advocate for what's good, and not necessarily because a movement has veered off its cause. It doesn't mean that the people on the ground do not need to be supported. So that's my comment.
So now we have questions, right? Thank you. I told you once one would start, then we'd get going.
My question is a bit of a two-parter. The first one is that there's a problem with the government not only not refusing to recognize the systemic racism, but it seems like they're trying to implement bills that further push systemic racism, like Bill 21, Bill 96, Bill 2, for example.
Yes.
So the first part of my question is, how can we, as students, be able to go against that? And obviously the answer to that would be like protest, peaceful protesting, activism, whatnot. But that brings me to my second part of my question, is that there are more and more cases of police brutality with the SPVM and the RCMP. And as students, most of us can't risk receiving that kind of brutality.
Yes.
So what ways can we do to make our voices heard and to avoid being put into harm just for making our voices heard?
Yeah, thank you. Those are really difficult questions because involves your own personal security. I think one of the most effective strategies that I've seen that young people use, which we take it for granted, write to your member of parliament, call your member of parliament, because sometimes the ability for an issue to be advocated for depends upon how many citizens are calling their representatives or writing to them in order for them to take action. So that's one of the strategies that worked for me during my time as a student, to bring issues about, for example, refugees. In 2011, 2013, 2014, when actually Professor Ara was, my professor. And then when the new government came in 2015, it was a big topic, in the 2015 federal elections. Syrian refugees were allowed into Canada. So had the other party, had students, not advocated, of course I'm not saying it's just students, you had other groups advocating. So we were able to welcome Syrian refugees, and 6 years on, some of these people are, contributing to Canada's economy. I don't know if you've seen a company called Peace by Chocolate that has employed hundreds of people and promoting messages of peace to Quebecers and the rest of Canada. Actually, Nova Scotians, was it in Nova Scotia or Newfoundland? Yeah, so I don't remember the location, but this is somebody who came in 2015. They established in Canada. Of course, they went through many barriers, but they were able to overcome them. And so connecting with your members of parliament, number one. Number two, it could be sharing an opinion. You could have a blog, you could have a podcast, where in times where, as you correctly mentioned, messages percolate as quickly as possible. Unfortunately, we also have the situation where the wrong messages are being propagated on social media. So, we live in difficult times, but I think if more people stand up to what essentially is evil, if you may, if many good people stand up, then I think it's going to create positive change. In regard to police brutality, I mean, it's very unfortunate, the SPVM, what people are going through in different communities. I was speaking to a friend when I was driving from Gatineau to here, who essentially told me that they're scared to walk at night in Montreal North. And in NDG, she works in Montreal North, lives in NDG, and it's very unfortunate that that's happening, in Montreal. I think I would recommend the same strategy. Message the mayor, message the councillors, and get as many young people and the peaceful protest, as you did mention. So these issues are quite big, and unfortunately there are gatekeepers that are not willing to let go off of what the system has been. But I'm seeing a trend on a continuum where these issues are coming to the forefront, and I hope that in my generation or the generation that comes after, that these issues are going to to be addressed. And I think for me, as I did mention, it's going to produce a positive net economic benefit for everyone. Because what's the purpose of hoarding all the money? I mean, I was speaking to a friend of mine, and they said, you can have as much money as you want, but you cannot drive 2 cars at the same time. You cannot live in 2 houses at the same time. I mean, there's a limit to how much happiness or how much fulfillment money can give you. And going back, if I come back to Rwanda in 1994, the Tutsis were being killed by the Hutus, and the main pretext was, ethnic differences. But some scholars have dug deep, and they actually connected that to economics. So one ethnicity wanting to marginalize the other ethnicity from an economic perspective, but using the differences to galvanize political power, and unfortunately, 1 million people being killed because of money, essentially. So, yeah, we can be activists and, talk to our representatives. And if it may be, run for office as well at some point. I think that's or, participate in a committee, or, so there's many ways to do that. Thanks.
Okay, well, to finish off, right, I want to add to what Moses says to answer your question. Unfortunately, if you follow some of the teachings and the theoretical writings of people like Gandhi, Martin Luther King, and Nelson Mandela, to bring about change, sometimes you have to put yourself in harm's way, truth be told, right? These people pioneered nonviolent forms of movement, and they've actually made a compelling argument that it takes more courage to get beaten and not respond. But the effect that has on an audience that's watching could be very, very, impactful, right? And sad as it is to say, I think that sometimes civil disobedience movements have demonstrated that, people have to be willing to put themselves in harm's way to advance certain issues in human history. Now, I'm not saying it's the only way. There's a lot of other tools that we have, that some of which Moses mentioned. But yeah, to answer your question, that sometimes that stuff is unfortunately also a necessary component that has moved history along. All right? So folks, this brings to close the Social Science Festival for 2021. I want to thank Moses very much for accepting my invitation, being here, and talking to us about these things. Thanks, Moses.
Thank you.